The last thing Dorothy said to me before they wheeled her through those doors was not goodbye. It wasn't, "I love you." It wasn't, "Help me." It was a number. 7 digits, spoken so quietly I had to lean in until my cheek almost touched hers, close enough to smell her rose water and the hospital soap they'd already made her use. She said it once. Didn't repeat it. Didn't explain. Just pressed my hand between both of hers, the way she used to when I was nervous before a big presentation, and said those 7 digits like she was reading them off the inside of her eyelids. Then Elliot came around the corner, clipboard in hand, and Dorothy's face went exactly blank. I stepped back, smiled at my husband, watched him sign the papers that committed his 71-year-old mother to a psychiatric facility for what he had told the intake coordinator was progressive cognitive decline and delusional episodes. She had burned the eggs that morning. That was the evidence. Before we go any further, what time is it? Where you are right now, drop your time and your country in the comments. I want to know who's awake for this one. The first time I met Dorothy Reeves, she was standing at the stove in a house that smelled like brown sugar, and Pine Sol wearing a yellow tuck-in blouse and a pair of slacks so crisp they could have stood up on their own. Elliot had warned me on the drive over. "She's particular," he said. "Don't take it personally if she's quiet at first. She takes time with people." What he didn't tell me was that she wouldn't be quiet at all. She turned from the stove, looked me over once, not unkindly but completely the way a person looks at a piece of architecture they're trying to understand, and said, "You've got your own money." It wasn't a question. I said, "Yes, ma'am." She nodded once, turned back to her pot and said, "Good, keep it that way." Elliot laughed from the doorway like she'd made a joke. I remember looking at the back of her head and thinking she was absolutely serious. That was 9 years ago. I was 30 years old, newly licensed as an interior architect, operating out of a studio apartment in Charlotte's Noda neighborhood, with 2 contractor clients, 1 part-time assistant, and more ambition than capital. Elliot was 35, already a named partner at a boutique real estate law firm downtown, already driving the kind of car that didn't need to announce itself. We had met at a continuing education seminar he was presenting on property law for developers. I was in the back row taking notes on a legal pad because my laptop battery was dead. He had noticed the legal pad. He said later that nobody under 40 used legal pads anymore, and it made him want to know everything about me. For a long time, I thought that was romantic. I understand now that what he meant was that I seemed like someone who could be understood, categorized, managed. We dated for 2 years, married in a small ceremony at a botanical garden in Belmont, 43 guests, Dorothy in the front row in a champagne dress crying before I'd even made it to the end of the aisle. Elliot's father had passed 4 years earlier, a heart attack, sudden the kind that doesn't give a family time to prepare, and it had been just the 2 of them since. Dorothy and Elliot. Mother and son. A tight unit or so, I believed. The first 5 years of the marriage were not unhappy. That's the most accurate way I know to say it. Not unhappy. There was comfort. There was a house in the Foxcroft neighborhood with original hardwood floors that I refinished myself over a long Labor Day weekend. There was a joint account for household expenses and separate accounts for everything else. My idea, Elliot had agreed with the mild tolerance of a man who expected to be obeyed eventually. There were dinners with Dorothy every other Sunday, and those I looked forward to genuinely. She made a pot roast that could make you believe in something. She kept a small television on the kitchen counter tuned to the local news, with the volume just loud enough to hear, and she had opinions about everything she watched. And she delivered those opinions with the precision of someone who had been thinking them over for decades. She also, I noticed early on, kept a fold of cash in the front pocket of whatever apron she was wearing. Not a small fold. Always at least $200, sometimes more. Crisp bills organized by denomination. I asked her about it once, maybe 6 months into the marriage. She was pulling a pan of cornbread from the oven, and she didn't look up when she answered. "A woman should always be able to leave," she said, "even if she doesn't." I didn't ask what she meant. I was 31 years old, and I thought I already knew. By year 6, things had shifted in ways I was still trying to name. Elliot had begun to manage, not dramatically, not in ways that produced scenes or evidence, but steadily like water finding the lowest point in a floor. He managed where we vacationed and how we spoke about money in front of other people, and which of my friends he found exhausting, and which of my professional decisions he supported. He never told me not to do anything. He simply made the cost of doing it very clear. My company had grown. By year 7, I had 6 full-time employees, a portfolio that included 2 boutique hotels and a private club renovation in Dilworth, and a professional reputation I had built entirely without his help. He came to the opening of my first major project, a historic renovation in 4th Ward, stood beside me in photographs, smiled at my clients, and on the drive home told me that the exposed brick in the main corridor was going to look dated in 3 years. Dorothy, who had also been there, called me the next morning. "Don't let him flatten you," she said. "Some men get scared when a woman starts taking up the right amount of space." I told her Elliot wasn't scared of anything. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That's what worries me, baby." I should have asked her what she meant by that too. Instead, I thanked her for coming, told her the cornbread at the reception was almost as good as hers, and let her make me laugh before we hung up. That was 8 months ago, before the emails, before I found the folder in the car, before Elliot started leaving his wedding ring on the nightstand like it was a set of keys he didn't need until morning, before I understood that Dorothy had never once in 9 years said a single thing she didn't mean. The ring was the first thing, not the first sign, I understand, that now looking back the way you only can when the story is already over. But the ring was the first thing I could point to, the first physical fact I couldn't talk myself out of. Elliot had worn his wedding band every day for 8 years. A simple platinum band, low profile, the kind of ring a man chooses when he wants it to be permanent. He'd worn it through depositions and golf and a minor hand surgery 2 years ago when they'd had to tape it to his palm in the recovery room because he wouldn't let them take it off. I had always noticed it, the way it caught light when he gestured in conversation, the way he twisted it slightly when he was thinking hard about something. In February, it started showing up on the nightstand. Not every night. 3 times a week, maybe. Then 4. I told myself he was washing his hands before bed and forgetting to put it back on. I told myself the skin underneath was bothering him. Some men developed sensitivities to metal over time. I told myself a lot of things in February. I had become, without quite realizing it, a very productive storyteller on my own behalf. The emails came in March. I wasn't looking. That is the truth, and I want to be precise about it, because I know how these stories get told, how people decide what kind of woman you were based on, whether you were snooping or stumbling. I was not snooping. I was using Elliot's laptop to pull up a vendor invoice. I'd forwarded to his printer by mistake, and his email was open, and the preview line of a message from First Carolina Private Banking read, "Retransfer authorization, secondary account confirmation." I didn't open it. I stood there in his home office for probably 45 seconds reading that preview line over and over, and then I closed the laptop, picked up my invoice from the printer tray, and walked back to my own office at the other end of the hall and sat down and stared at the wall. Secondary account. Elliot and I had a joint household account, our individual accounts, and a shared investment account we'd opened in year 3. 4 accounts between us, all of which I had full visibility into. I knew of no secondary account. The word secondary implies a primary something established. First, something the secondary is meant to supplement or shadow. That evening at dinner, I asked him as casually as I could construct it whether he'd been dealing with anything complicated at work. New clients, maybe. anything that had him moving money around in unusual ways. He looked at me across the table with the patient expression of a man explaining traffic to someone who doesn't drive. "Finance stuff," he said. "Nothing you need to think about." I nodded, served myself more rice, let the silence sit there between us like a third person at the table. That was the thing about Elliot's particular kind of control. It never announced itself. It didn't raise its voice or make demands you could argue against. It simply reclassified things. Entire categories of our shared life became his categories quietly over time, until the reclassification felt so normal that questioning it felt like the unreasonable act. Finance stuff, work things, details you don't need. He had been doing it for years, and I had let it happen because the alternative, the confrontation, the scene, the acknowledgement of what the scene would mean, had always seemed like the more expensive choice. I called Dorothy that night from the bathroom with the fan running. She picked up on the second ring. I didn't tell her about the email. I don't know why. Some instinct told me to hold it, to not say the thing out loud until I knew what shape it actually was. Instead, I asked her how she was feeling, whether her knee was giving her trouble, whether she needed me to bring groceries on Sunday. She let me run through the whole list. Then she said Genesis. What happened? Not a question. Dorothy never asked questions when she already knew the answer. I said nothing. I'm just checking in. She was quiet for a moment. In the background, I could hear her television, the low murmur of the evening news. "Come by this week," she said finally. "Not Sunday. Before Sunday. Come Tuesday, come for lunch. I'll make the chicken." I said I would. And Genesis. "Yes, ma'am." "When you come," she said, "come alone." She hung up before I could ask her what she meant. I stood in the bathroom with the fan running and the phone in my hand, and the beginnings of something cold settling in my chest that I would spend the next 2 weeks trying to convince myself was just the air conditioning. It wasn't the air conditioning. 4 days later, on a Thursday evening in late March, I went to pick Elliot up from a dinner downtown because his car was in the shop. He'd texted me the restaurant name. I parked on the street and called him to say I was outside, and while I waited, I reached into the back seat for my jacket and knocked his leather portfolio off the seat. It fell open on the floor. I almost didn't look. I want to be honest about that. Some part of me, the part that had been managing the cost of knowing for months, almost just picked it up and set it back on the seat without looking at what had spilled out. But the words, "Petition for Dissolution of Marriage," were printed in a font large enough to read from the driver's seat. And below it, the date. 6 weeks from that Thursday. I put the papers back exactly as I'd found them. Closed the portfolio, set it on the seat. When Elliot came out of the restaurant 2 minutes later, tie loosened, smelling like bourbon and client dinners, I smiled at him from the driver's seat. "Good night," I asked. "Productive," he said. I pulled into traffic, and I did not say one more word the entire drive home. I went to see Dorothy on Tuesday. I brought lunch from her favorite Caribbean place on Freedom Drive, oxtail rice and peas. Fried plantains, the ginger beer she liked in the glass bottle, not the can. I told myself the whole drive over that I was simply visiting my mother-in-law, that I was being a good daughter-in-law, that whatever Dorothy had wanted to tell me could be small, could be nothing, could be an old woman's worry about her son that had nothing to do with what I'd seen in the back seat of my own car. I believed none of it. Dorothy met me at the door before I'd finished knocking. She was dressed like she was expecting someone important, pressed lilac blouse, good slacks, the small pearl earrings she saved for church and occasions she'd decided mattered. She looked at the bags in my hands and then at my face, and something in her expression settled like a decision she'd already made had just been confirmed. "Come in," she said. "Close the door behind you." Her house was a 3-bedroom craftsman in Dorita that she'd lived in for 31 years. Elliot had grown up in this house. Every surface held something: framed photographs, a collection of glass birds on the windowsill, stacks of library books on the side table she cycled through at a pace that still impressed me. The television was on volume low, tuned to the local news. It was always on. Dorothy said silence made a house feel abandoned. We ate at the kitchen table. She asked about my work, about a hotel project I'd mentioned the last time I'd seen her, about whether I was sleeping enough. The questions were genuine, but they were also filler, and we both knew it. And Dorothy was not a woman who filled space without reason. I got through half my oxtail before I put my fork down. "Dorothy," I said, "what did you want to tell me?" She set her own fork down with the deliberateness of a woman who had been waiting for exactly this. Folded her hands on the table. Looked at me over the wire rims of her glasses in a way that made me feel like I was about to receive information that was going to change the shape of something. "How much do you know," she said, "about your husband's father's estate?" I told her what I knew, which was not much. Gerald Reeves had died 7 years before I met Elliot. Heart attack sudden at 63. He had been a commercial contractor, built his business from one truck and a city contract in the early 80s into a mid-size operation that had worked on half the public buildings in Mecklenburg County. Elliot didn't speak about him often. When he did, it was with a kind of compressed pride that didn't leave room for questions. Dorothy listened to everything I said. Then she said, "Gerald left a will." I said I assumed so. "The will named Elliot," she said. "But it also named me. Joint inheritance. Business assets, property holdings, 3 parcels of commercial land in Cabarrus County that had been sitting empty for 19 years, appreciating at a rate that would make your eyes water." I was quiet. She continued, "When Elliot and I went through probate, he handled everything. I signed what he put in front of me because he is my son, and because I trusted him, and because grief makes you slow in ways you don't notice until later." She paused. 2 years ago, I hired my own attorney. A woman I found on my own, didn't tell Elliot, paid her out of my household account in cash over 6 months. She reached across the table and put her hand over mine. "Genesis, your name is on those Cabarrus County parcels. Elliot added it in year 2 of your marriage. I don't believe he remembers doing it. His attorney drafted 100 documents that year during a refinancing, and I think it slipped through. But your name is there. Has been there for 7 years. Which means when he files to dissolve this marriage, those parcels become a joint marital asset subject to division." The kitchen was very quiet. The television murmured from the counter. Outside, a car passed on the street. "He doesn't know I know," she said. "And he doesn't know you know. And I need it to stay that way." I asked her how she was certain about the documents. She stood up from the table, went to the cabinet above the refrigerator, the one everyone uses for things they don't need often, and reached behind 2 boxes of cereal and a tin of loose-leaf tea. She brought back a manila folder, thick closed with a rubber band, and set it in front of me. "My attorney made copies," she said. "Originals are in the safe." I looked up. "What safe?" Dorothy sat back down, picked up her fork like the most difficult part of the conversation was behind us now. "The one Gerald built into the floor of the study," she said. "Under the Tabriz rug, northeast corner. Elliot has never once moved that rug in 31 years, because he's always thought it was ugly, and I've always let him think it was ugly on purpose." She said the combination was a 7-digit number. When she told me what it was, I had to set my glass down. It was my birthday. Month, day, year, no spaces. Gerald Reeves had set that combination, sometime before I existed, before Elliot had met me, before any of this, and yet there it was, waiting in the floor of a dead man's study, like a key cut for a door that hadn't been built yet. Why, I said, and I meant all of it. Why my birthday? Why now? Why me? Dorothy looked at me over her glasses. "Because Gerald knew Elliot," she said simply, And he knew Elliot would need someone to answer to eventually. He just didn't know her name yet. I drove home that evening with the manila folder on the passenger seat and my hands very steady on the wheel, and something hardening in my chest that was not grief, and was not anger, and was not fear. It was clarity. For the first time in months, I could see exactly where I was standing. And more importantly, I could see exactly what Elliot couldn't. I did not confront him. I want to be clear about that, because I know the impulse I felt it. The night I came home with that folder, sitting in the driveway for 11 minutes, with the engine running, my hands still on the wheel, the urge to walk through the front door and put every document on the kitchen table and watch his face understand what had happened. I felt that impulse fully. I let it move through me like weather. And then I let it pass, because I had learned something from 9 years of watching Elliot Reeves operate. He was at his most dangerous when he was surprised. A cornered man with a law degree and existing paperwork and a plan already 6 weeks from execution was not a man you surprised in his own kitchen on a Tuesday night. That was a man you prepared for. Carefully, on your own timeline. With documentation he didn't know existed, and an attorney he had never met. I went inside, made tea, asked him how his day was. He said fine. He was on his laptop at the kitchen counter, barely looking up. I watched him for a moment, the silver ring of his signet catching the under-cabinet light, the slight furrow between his brows that meant he was drafting something, and I thought about the fact that somewhere in that laptop or on a server his firm controlled, there was a petition with my name on it, and a date circled, and a column of assets arranged in a way designed to leave me with 8% of what I had spent 9 years helping to build. I finished my tea, rinsed the mug, said goodnight. Early morning, I told him. He said okay without looking up. I lay in bed that night and made a list in my head. Not on paper, not yet, not in this house, but in my head, organized and sequential, the way I approached every project that mattered. What I had, what I needed, what had to happen, in what order. Dorothy's folder was in my car, locked in the document compartment beneath the passenger seat, tucked inside a reusable grocery bag, because the mundane hides things better than the deliberate. The next morning, I called an attorney, not anyone Elliot knew. Not anyone who moved in the circles we moved in, who attended the same bar association events, who might mention a new client at the wrong moment over the wrong drink. I called a woman named Patricia Osei, whose name I'd found 8 months ago before the emails, before the portfolio, some earlier instinct that I hadn't fully understood yet and written in the back of a notebook I kept in my office at work. Family law, 22 years of practice. Her firm was in Concord, 40 minutes north, far enough that Charlotte's professional network wouldn't fold back on itself. I called from my office door closed during a gap between client meetings. Patricia Osei answered her own phone. I told her I needed a consultation. I told her I had documentation. I told her I needed everything discussed under privilege, and I needed to move quickly, but not visibly. She said, "Come Thursday. Bring everything you have. Don't tell your husband you're coming, and don't use a shared calendar." I already hadn't. I was learning. Thursday, I told Elliot I had a site visit in Concord for a potential commercial client. This was plausible. I had legitimate work in that direction. And Elliot had long since stopped asking detailed questions about my professional schedule, which I understood now was less about trust and more about disinterest. My work had always been a backdrop to him, something that made me financially independent enough to be a suitable partner, but not something that warranted his full attention. He had never once asked me what a project actually involved. That incuriosity was, as it turned out, one of his most significant miscalculations. Patricia Osei's office was on the second floor of a building that smelled like copy paper and coffee. She was 50-something compact, with close-cropped natural hair and reading glasses she took on and off while we talked like punctuation. She went through Dorothy's folder methodically, page by page, making small notes in a yellow legal pad. I watched her face the way I always watched faces when something important was being evaluated. She gave very little away. That made me trust her more. When she finished, she set the folder down, took off her glasses, and looked at me directly. "The Cabarrus parcels are the centerpiece," she said. "Current assessed value combined is just over $4 million. Market value, given the development pressure on that corridor right now, is closer to $6 million. With your name already on record as co-owner, those assets cannot be excluded from marital property division, regardless of how his petition is structured. He would have needed you to sign a specific waiver. There is no waiver." I asked what she needed from me. She put her glasses back on. "Time. Not much, but some. I need to pull the deed records myself, get a second look at the probate filing from 7 years ago, and I need you to get me access to the original documents, the ones in the safe." I told her about Dorothy, about the facility, about the timeline. She was quiet for a moment. "How certain are you," she said carefully, "that Mrs. Reeves is competent to participate if needed?" I thought about Dorothy at her kitchen table, in her pressed lilac blouse. The pearl earrings, the folders she had retrieved from behind the cereal boxes with the efficiency of a woman who had placed it there with intention. The way she had told me the combination without flinching. "Completely certain," I said. Patricia nodded, made another note. "Then we move carefully, and we move soon. He has 6 weeks on his timeline. We need 4. I drove back to Charlotte through light afternoon traffic with the windows down and the radio off. And a sensation I hadn't felt in longer than I could accurately calculate, the particular steadiness of a person who knows exactly what they are doing and exactly why. That evening, Elliot was already home when I got in. He was on the phone in his study door, half-open, voice low, and even in the way it got when he was talking to someone he was performing confidence for. I walked past without stopping, changed my clothes, started dinner. At the table, he asked about the site visit. "Good," I said. "Promising client. I think it'll move forward." He nodded already, looking at his phone. "Good," he said. I watched him scroll, and I thought about 6 weeks and 4 weeks, and a safe beneath a rug that he had never once found ugly enough to look under. I thought about Dorothy in a facility that smelled like antiseptic, and institutional food put there by her own son to silence the one person in the world who knew where Gerald Reeves had kept his most important things. I thought about the combination. My birthday. And I understood in a way I hadn't fully let myself understand yet that Gerald Reeves had not set that combination by accident. Gerald had known his son, had loved him and known him, and built a contingency into the floor of his own house for the day that knowledge became necessary. That day had come. I was not going to waste it. The lawyers came on a Friday, not Patricia Elliot's lawyers. 2 of them from his own firm, which told me everything about how confident he was feeling. You don't send colleagues to negotiate with your wife unless you've already decided the outcome, and you're simply managing the paperwork. They arrived at 11 in the morning, which told me something else. He had scheduled this for a time, when he knew I'd be home, but when the neighborhood would be quiet, and there would be no witnesses to the shape of it. I had known they were coming, not because Elliot told me. He hadn't. But 3 days earlier, I had found the email thread on the printer. He'd sent a document to our home printer by mistake, caught it almost immediately, and deleted it from the queue. But almost isn't the same as completely, and the single page that had made it through before he canceled the job was enough. A scheduling memo. Friday, 11 a.m. Reeves Residential. I had left it exactly where it fell from the printer tray and said nothing. When the doorbell rang, I was in the kitchen in a cream silk blouse and tailored trousers, drinking coffee, already dressed for a meeting I had invented. I opened the door and looked at the 2 men on my front porch, both in dark suits, both younger than Elliot, both carrying the particular expression of people who have been told this will be straightforward. And I smiled the smile I used for difficult clients. "Good morning," I said. "Come in." Elliot was already in the living room. He had positioned himself in the armchair, which I noted. Not the sofa where we might have sat together. The armchair angled slightly toward the center of the room, the chair of a man running a meeting. He didn't look at me when I came in. He looked at the space just past my shoulder and said, "Genesis, these are colleagues of mine. They're here to help us work through some details about our future." "Our future," I said. "Of course." I sat on the sofa, crossed my ankles, held my coffee cup in both hands. The younger of the two men, he introduced himself as Brandon, said it with the smooth confidence of someone who had done this before and expected it to be unpleasant, but brief, opened a leather portfolio and produced a document that he slid across the coffee table toward me. "Mrs. Reeves, we've prepared a separation and property agreement that we believe fairly reflects the contributions of both parties over the course of the marriage. Mr. Reeves is committed to making this transition as efficient as possible for everyone involved." I looked at the document without touching it. "How thoughtful," I said. Brandon continued. The agreement, he explained, proposed a division in which Elliot would retain the Foxcroft house, the joint investment account his business interests, and what was described as primary real property holdings. I would receive the contents of my personal account, my business, which was listed separately, valued by an assessor I had never been contacted by, at a number roughly 40% below what my last professional valuation had shown, and a lump sum payment described as equitable consideration. The lump sum was $230,000. I picked up the document then, turned to page 4, where the asset schedule was laid out in columns, and read it the way I had learned to read contracts, not for what was there, but for what was missing. The Cabarrus County parcels were not listed anywhere, not in his column, not in mine, not in a disputed category. They did not exist on this document at all. 3 parcels of commercial land worth $6 million at current market value had been omitted from a legal agreement designed to divide our marital assets, and the 2 men sitting across from me were waiting for me to either not notice or not know what that meant. I set the document back on the coffee table. "I'll need to have my attorney review this," I said. Elliot's jaw moved slightly. "Genesis, we've structured this to be straightforward. The sooner we sign the cleaner, this is for both of us." "I'm sure," I said. "I'll still need my attorney to review it." Brandon and his colleague exchanged a look that was almost imperceptible. Almost. "Of course," Brandon said, recovering smoothly. "We'd simply note that the offer as structured reflects a good faith position, and that certain elements of it may become less favorable if the process becomes protracted." I looked at him. "Is that a threat, Brandon?" He said, "No, of course not. A clarification only." "Good," I said. I stood, which ended the meeting in a way that left no room for debate. "I'll be in touch through my attorney. You can let yourselves out. Have a meeting in 20 minutes. I picked up my coffee and walked to the kitchen. Behind me, I heard the shuffle of papers being gathered, the low exchange of murmured words, the front door opening and closing. Then silence. Then Elliot in the kitchen doorway. I was rinsing my coffee cup. I didn't turn around. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," he said. His voice had the texture of a man who was still certain he was winning, but had encountered minor, unexpected friction. "I'm protecting my interests," I said, "the way you've been protecting yours. 230 is a fair number, Genesis." I turned off the tap, dried my hands on the dish towel, turned around and looked at my husband of 9 years standing in his own kitchen in his good suit, silver signet ring on his right hand, completely certain that he had accounted for everything. "Elliot," I said, "when's the last time you moved the rug in your father's study?" Something crossed his face. Fast, small, and then gone, the flicker of a man who has heard something unexpected and is deciding whether it matters. What does that have to do with anything? I smiled. Not the client's smile. A different one. I have a meeting, I said. I'll be in touch through my attorney. I picked up my bag and walked out of my own house and got into my car and pulled out of the driveway with my hands perfectly steady and my heart beating at a rate I could feel in my fingertips. My phone buzzed before I reached the end of the block. Elliot. Calling, not texting. I let it ring. He called again before I hit the highway, then a third time, then a text, Genesis. What do you know about the study? I put my phone face down on the passenger seat and drove north toward Concord and Patricia Osei's office and did not look at it again for 45 minutes. Some questions are better left to marinate, especially the ones that tell you exactly how scared a person is by the fact that they asked at all. Patricia pulled the deed records herself on a Monday. She called me at 8:47 in the morning, which told me she had been at her desk for a while already, and her voice had the particular quality of a person who has found exactly what they were looking for and is taking care to present it without theater. The parcels are clean, she said. 3 separate deeds. Cabarrus County Register of Deeds, all 3 recorded in year 2 of your marriage. Your name appears as co-grantee on every document. Genesis Adizi Reeves. Your full legal name spelled correctly. Social Security number appended on the filing copy. This was not an accident, Genesis. Someone instructed a paralegal to put your name on those documents. The instruction is in the file notes. I was in my car in the parking deck below my office. I had not yet gone upstairs, Gerald, I said. The instruction predates your marriage by 4 months, she said. It was in a sealed addendum to the original estate plan filed with the probate court and apparently never opened by anyone other than the attorney who drafted it. Gerald Reeves wrote a letter directing that in the event his son married, the parcels were to be redeeded to include the spouse within 24 months of the marriage date. The letter is dated 8 months before Gerald died. I sat with that for a moment. A man who had been dead for 16 years had looked far enough ahead to account for a woman he would never meet. He knew Elliot would need a check, I said. That's my read, Patricia said. Now, the safe. I had been waiting for this conversation. Dorothy had been in the facility for 11 days. I had visited 4 times twice during the window Elliot approved for family visits, twice outside it, signing in as a family friend during the afternoon shift change when the front desk was occupied with medication rounds, and the log was less carefully monitored. Dorothy was sharp at every visit, sharper, if anything, than she'd been in months. The enforced stillness seemed to have clarified something in her the way cold clarifies broth. She asked precise questions about where we were in the process. She remembered every number I gave her. On my 3rd visit, she had pressed a folded piece of paper into my hand when the aide's back was turned. On the paper, in her careful schoolteacher handwriting, was the safe combination written out in words rather than digits. Your birth month as a number, your birth day, your birth year, all 4 digits. And below that, a single line, bottom shelf. Accordion folder, red tab. I had not yet been to the house. Elliot was still living there. Going to his father's study to open a safe in the floor while my husband was present and already suspicious was not something I was prepared to do on instinct alone. But 3 days after Patricia's call, Elliot went to Columbia for a deposition. 2 nights, he said. Possibly 3. He told me this at breakfast with the blandness of a man who had stopped feeling obligated to perform normalcy. I waited until his car left the street. Then I drove to Dorothy's house. She had given me a key years ago, in case of emergency, she'd said, and pressed it into my palm after I'd helped her home from a procedure, and I had kept it on my keychain ever since, without Elliot ever once noticing or asking. The house was locked and quiet, holding the particular stillness of a space from which someone has recently and unwillingly been removed. The glass birds on the windowsill, the library books, the television off for the first time I could remember. The study was at the back of the house, north-facing the way Gerald had wanted it. dark wood floor-to-ceiling shelves, a desk that had belonged to his father before him. The Tabriz rug covered most of the floor. Deep red and navy warned a softness in the traffic paths, the kind of rug that absorbs a room's history without showing it. I had always thought it was beautiful. Elliot had always called it old. I moved the desk chair, rolled back one edge of the rug. The safe was there. Flush with the floor, a steel panel approximately 18 inches square with a digital keypad recessed into one corner. No brand markings, the kind of thing built to be invisible. I knelt on the hardwood, entered the combination. The keypad accepted it on the first try. Inside 3 shelves, bottom shelf, as Dorothy had said. An accordion folder, red tab thick with age, the clasp warned a smoothness from handling. I lifted it out and opened it on the desk. The contents were organized with Gerald Reeves's characteristic precision. Each section labeled in his handwriting, the same strong, upright hand I'd seen in framed notes Dorothy kept on her refrigerator. Property deeds, survey maps, a copy of the original estate plan with a sealed addendum still paperclipped to the front, a handwritten ledger recording 22 years of payments improvements and tax assessments on the Cabarrus parcels, a document that established beyond any procedural doubt that these assets had been actively maintained and were anything but dormant. And at the very back, in a separate sealed envelope marked with nothing but a date, the date of Elliot and Genesis's wedding written in Gerald's hand, a letter. I sat down in Gerald's chair and opened it. It was addressed to no one by name. If you are reading this, it began. Then Elliot has done something that required someone else to look here. I'm sorry for that. I raised him to be better, and I believe somewhere in him he is. But I also know him. And I know that fear in a man who has never been checked can become something that damages the people closest to him. I built this house. I built what is in this safe. I built it for my family, which has always meant more than one person. Whatever is happening, protect yourself. Use what is here. That is what it is for. There was no signature, just the date. I sat in Gerald Reeves's chair in Gerald Reeves's study for a long time after that. Long enough for the afternoon light to shift through the north-facing window and move across the floor in a slow diagonal. Then I photographed every document with my phone, replaced everything exactly as I had found it, closed the safe, rolled the rug back, moved the chair. I called Patricia from the driveway. I have everything I said. A pause. Then, how soon can you be in Concord? An hour, I said. I'll be here. I drove north through the late afternoon with Gerald's letter photographed on my phone, and the accordion folder's contents already uploading to the encrypted drive Patricia had set up for our case, and something in my chest that felt for the first time, in a very long time, like the specific relief of a foundation that has been checked and confirmed solid. Elliot had spent 9 years believing he was the one who understood how structures worked. He had married an architect. He should have known better. The appointment at the notary's office was scheduled for 10 in the morning. I know this because Patricia had pulled the filing from the county clerk's system 3 days before it happened. A deed transfer request submitted by Elliot's firm seeking to consolidate the 3 Cabarrus parcels under a single LLC registered in Delaware 2 weeks earlier. The LLC had 1 member. The registered agent address was a mailbox service in Wilmington. The member's name was not Elliot Reeves. It was a holding company name 11 words long, designed to be unmemorable, the kind of entity that exists specifically to make ownership difficult to trace. Patricia had seen structures like this before. He's moving them offshore of the marital estate before he files, she said. Once they're in the LLC, he argues they're a business asset, not a personal one, and the question of whether they're marital property becomes a litigation battle instead of a clear fact. It buys him time, and it costs you money and certainty. He's done this before Genesis. Not with you, with clients. I've seen this exact structure in 3 other cases. I asked her how she wanted to handle it. She smiled for the first time since I'd met her. We show up. The notary's office was on South Tryon Street, 12 floors up, in a building with a marble lobby and a coffee cart that smelled like burnt milk. Patricia had filed a motion the previous afternoon, an emergency injunction citing marital property interests in the parcels and requesting the deed transfer be stayed pending full disclosure in the divorce proceedings. The motion had been granted at 7:14 that morning by a judge who Patricia, to her credit, had never once implied she knew personally, though. The speed suggested familiarity with her work. We arrived at 9:52. The elevator opened onto a waiting area with low chairs and the particular silence of a professional space on a weekday morning. A receptionist looked up. Patricia gave her name and the case reference number, and we were shown to a conference room at the end of a short hall. Elliot was already there. He was standing at the window with his back to the door when we walked in. Phone in hand, the posture of a man who had arrived early to establish territorial comfort. His personal attorney, a man named Garrison I had heard mentioned, but never met, older, silver-haired, the kind of lawyer who wore his reputation visibly, was seated at the table with a folder open in front of him. A notary I didn't recognize sat at the far end, pen-ready professional neutrality arranged on her face like furniture. Elliot turned when he heard the door. The expression that moved across his face in that first second was something I had never seen on him before. Not anger I had seen. Not surprise exactly. Something beneath surprise. The look of a man whose internal map has just failed to match the terrain. He recovered in under 2 seconds. I counted. "Genesis," he said. His voice was even. "This is a business filing. You don't need to be here." "I know," I said. I set my bag on the table and sat down across from Garrison. "That's why I brought my attorney." Patricia placed a document in front of Garrison without preamble. "The transfer has been stayed. Judge Morrow's order issued this morning at 7:14. The parcels remain in their current titled status pending full disclosure and equitable distribution proceedings." Garrison looked at the order, looked at Patricia, looked at Elliot. Elliot was looking at me. "How," he said. The single word quiet and stripped of everything except the actual question. I didn't answer. Patricia didn't give me the chance. She was already walking Garrison through the documentation. Efficient and unhurried, the deed records, the probate addendum, Gerald's ledger, the 22 years of tax records, establishing continuous marital adjacent maintenance of the properties. Garrison was a good attorney. I watched him read, and I watched the moment he understood the scope of what he was looking at. A small tightening around his eyes, a barely perceptible stillness that replaced the comfortable authority he'd walked in with. "These deeds," he said to Patricia, "have not been produced in discovery." "They haven't been requested yet," she said pleasantly, "because the petition hasn't been formally filed yet. Mr. Reeves filed for this transfer before initiating proceedings, which means he was attempting to move marital assets before the court had jurisdiction to protect them. We have documented the timeline." She set another page in front of Garrison. "We'll be filing our own petition this afternoon. Irretrievable breakdown, equitable distribution, and a request for sanctions related to the attempted pre-filing asset transfer." The room was very quiet. The notary had put her pen down. Elliot pulled out the chair across from me and sat. This surprised me. I had expected him to stay standing to use height, as he usually did, to manage the physical space, the way he managed everything else. Instead, he sat, which meant something in him had recalculated. He placed both hands flat on the table and looked at me with an expression I had not seen in 9 years of marriage. Not the patient condescension, not the mild management. Something rawer, something that might, in a different context, have looked like respect. "The safe," he said. Not an accusation, almost a statement of fact, an acknowledgement. "Your father built it," I said. He also set the combination. A muscle in Elliot's jaw moved. He never told me what was in it. I know, I said. He told your mother. Something shifted in Elliot's face at that. Genuine and unguarded, and gone, before it fully formed a flash of something that might have been grief or guilt, or the particular pain of a man who has just understood something about his father that cost him more than he expected. Garrison leaned toward Elliot and said something low. Elliot didn't respond for a moment. He was still looking at me. She's not senile, he said. Not to anyone in particular, almost to himself. No, I said. She is not. He looked down at his hands on the table. The signet ring caught the overhead light. The combination, he said quietly. Was it always? Yes, I said. Since before I existed. I watched him absorb that. The full weight of it, his father's foresight, his mother's silence, 7 years of a safe he had never thought to open because he had never thought he needed to, because he had never imagined that the most important document in his family's history had been waiting under an ugly rug for a woman his father had named before he knew her name. Garrison spoke up then, his voice reclaiming the professional register. I think we should take a short recess and allow my client and me to confer. Of course, Patricia said. Elliot stood. He and Garrison moved toward the door. At the threshold, Elliot stopped and turned back, once not to Patricia, to me. He looked at me for a long moment. I held it without moving. Then he said I should have moved that rug. He said it without heat, without accusation. The simple acknowledgement of a man who had just understood the precise location and nature of his own miscalculation. Yes, I said. You should have. He turned and walked out. The door closed. Patricia gathered her documents with the unhurried efficiency of a woman who had won this particular morning and knew exactly what came next. Outside the window, 12 floors down, South Tryon moved through its ordinary Friday rhythm taxi's pedestrians, a delivery truck navigating the loading zone with familiar patience. I sat for a moment in the sudden quiet of the conference room and let it settle. 9 years, $230,000, and a signature on a document designed to make me invisible. A mother put in a facility to silence the one person who knew where the truth was kept, and a safe in a floor that had been waiting patiently, silently in the dark under an ugly rug for exactly this morning. Gerald Reeves, I thought, had been an exceptionally thorough man. The first thing to fall was the LLC. Patricia filed the petition that afternoon as promised, and by Monday morning, Elliot's Delaware holding company, 11 unmemorable words, one mailbox in Wilmington had been named in the injunction and was effectively frozen pending full disclosure. The county recorder's office was notified. The transfer that had been scheduled to complete quietly on a Friday morning, witnessed by a notary who would have had no reason to ask questions, did not complete. The parcels stayed exactly where Gerald Reeves had put them, right where they had always been. By Tuesday, the second thing fell. Elliot's managing partner called him in. I did not know this directly. I knew it the way I had learned to know things in this marriage through peripheral evidence, the small alterations in the atmosphere of a shared life. He came home Tuesday evening, 40 minutes later than usual, went directly to his study without stopping in the kitchen, and did not come out for 2 hours. When he did, his collar was open, and he had the particular flatness in his expression of a man who has spent time in a conversation he did not control. Later, I would learn the shape of it from Patricia, who had a professional contact at the firm. Nothing improper, just the ordinary information flow of a legal community small enough that significant internal events didn't stay internal for long. The managing partner had questions. Specifically, he had questions about the Delaware LLC, which had been registered using the firm's general counsel mailing address as the registered agent without authorization, and about whether any firm resources or client trust structures had been used in connection with a personal asset transfer by a named partner. These were serious questions, the kind that convened an internal review committee, the kind that placed a partner on administrative leave while the review was conducted. Elliot's name was removed from the firm's website on Wednesday. I saw it because I looked. I had gotten into the habit of checking the way you check weather before a long drive, not because you can change it, but because you want to know what you're moving through. The third thing fell on Thursday. His business partner, a developer named Curtis, with whom Elliot had co-invested in 4 residential projects over the past 3 years, called to dissolve their arrangement. Patricia had sent a records request to the county that encompassed those projects as part of the broader asset disclosure. And Curtis, whose name appeared on documents that were now part of an active matrimonial proceeding, had apparently decided that proximity to Elliot's situation was not a risk he was willing to absorb. He retained his own attorney. The dissolution was handled through letters. No conversation, no meeting. Just paper efficiently applied. Curtis had known Elliot for 11 years. I thought about that. About what it meant when the people who had moved through a man's professional life read the situation and chose distance. It told you something not about the legal merits, which were still being established, but about the accumulated impression. The thing people had sensed and set aside, and were now given a specific permission to notice, no longer setting aside. Elliot called me 11 times that Thursday night. I counted because I watched the screen each time his name appeared, and felt nothing in particular, not satisfaction, not pain, not the complex, weighted sadness I might have expected. Just a kind of stillness. The calls came between 9:14 p.m. and 12:03 a.m. The 11th one I watched ring to voicemail, and then I turned my phone face down on the nightstand and slept. I had moved to the second bedroom 2 weeks earlier after the meeting on South Tryon. Elliot had not objected. We were past the performance of normalcy by then. Friday morning, there were 3 text messages. The first said, "We need to talk." The second, 40 minutes later, "Genesis, I'm asking you to call me." The third, sent at 11:58 p.m. after the last unanswered call. I didn't know about the combination. I need you to know that. I didn't know what he put in there. I read that third one twice. I believed him, actually. That was the complicated part, the part that didn't fit the cleaner version of the story where everything Elliot had done was calculated from the beginning, where his father's safe and its combination were simply an oversight in an otherwise comprehensive deception. I believed that Elliot had not known the combination was my birthday. I believed he had not known the full contents of the safe. I believed Gerald had kept that from him deliberately, and that somewhere in Elliot's understanding of his father, there was now a wound he hadn't anticipated. But I also knew that a man could be genuinely ignorant of one thing while being fully deliberate about everything else. The petition had been deliberate. The LLC had been deliberate. The $230,000, 8% of what was rightfully mine, had been deliberate. The psychiatric facility had been deliberate. That last one I kept coming back to. I visited Dorothy on Saturday morning. She looked better than she had the week before. Sharper at the edges, more present the slightly flattened quality that institutions impose on people beginning to wear off. As the end of her time there became visible, Patricia had filed the motion to vacate the commitment order on Thursday, supported by a declaration from Dorothy's own physician. Not the facility's staff, her actual physician of 14 years, who had reviewed her records and stated in unambiguous medical language that there was no clinical basis for the involuntary admission. The hearing was scheduled for Wednesday. "Tell me everything," Dorothy said when I settled into the chair beside her bed. I told her. All of it. The LLC, the managing partner, Curtis's dissolution. The 11 calls. She listened without interrupting, which was not her natural mode, which told me she understood this was a report that needed to be received whole. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Outside her window, a maintenance worker was moving across the facility lawn on a riding mower, the sound muffled to near silence by the double-paned glass. "The partners," she said finally. "That's the one he won't recover from quickly. A man can lose money and rebuild. Losing the partners, that's reputation. That takes longer." "Yes," I said. She looked at her hands in her lap. Dorothy's hands were remarkable large for her frame, capable the hands of a woman who had made things and fixed things and held things together for a long time. "He put me here," she said, not with anger, with the measured clarity of a person naming a fact that still required naming. "He did," I said, because he was afraid of what I knew. "Yes." She nodded slowly. Gerald used to say that fear was the only thing that made Elliot careless. Said every other mistake Elliot ever made came from fear. She paused. I used to defend him when Gerald said things like that. I used to say Gerald was too hard on him. She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. I reached over and covered her hands with mine. We sat like that for a while in the muffled quiet of the room, while the mower made slow passes across the lawn outside and the afternoon moved through its ordinary hours. "Wednesday," I told her. "You'll be home Wednesday." She squeezed my hand once. Then she straightened in her chair with the deliberate composure of a woman reclaiming her own posture in a space that had been trying to diminish her. "I know," she said. "I've already decided what I'm making for dinner." She said it so precisely, so completely like herself, that I laughed the first real laugh in longer than I could accurately track the kind that starts in the chest before the face has decided to participate. Dorothy watched me laugh with the expression she reserved for things she found privately satisfying. "Pot roast," she said. "Gerald's recipe, the one Elliot never liked." Outside, the mower made another slow pass. Somewhere in the building, a door opened and closed. The afternoon light shifted through the window and moved across the floor in the same slow diagonal I had watched move across Gerald's study 3 weeks earlier, and I thought about how light does. That moves through spaces without asking permission, indifferent to what those spaces have been used for, simply marking time. Elliot had 11 missed calls sitting in my phone. The dominoes were still falling. And on Wednesday, Dorothy Reeves was coming home. The hearing was at 9 in the morning in a courtroom on the 4th floor of the Mecklenburg County Courthouse. Dorothy wore the purple dress. I did not know she had planned this until I arrived at the facility at 7:30 to help her get ready, and found her already dressed, seated at the edge of the bed with her hands folded in her lap, and the small pearl earrings in, and the wire-rimmed glasses clean to clarity. The dress was deep, violet-structured wool crepe, the kind of garment that had been purchased for an occasion and preserved carefully for decades. She had pressed it herself using the facility's communal iron, which I found out later she had requested from the staff 3 days in advance. I asked her about the dress when I saw it. She said I wore this the day Elliot was born. Seemed right to wear it the day I stopped letting him make decisions about my life. There was nothing to say to that. I handed her her coat. Patricia met us in the lobby. She had filed a 40-page submission the week before Dorothy's physician declaration. 14 years of clean medical records, a statement from Dorothy's neighbor of 26 years, a statement from her pastor, and a detailed timeline, then establishing that the sole precipitating event cited in Elliot's commitment petition was a single burned breakfast documented by no one except Elliot himself. She had also filed a motion for sanctions against Elliot, personally citing the use of a mental health commitment as a mechanism to suppress a material witness in an active matrimonial proceeding. That last filing had attracted attention. The courtroom was not large, but it was not empty either. Elliot's matrimonial case had been quiet. These things usually were in Charlotte's professional circles until they weren't. But the commitment hearing, once it appeared in the public docket, had drawn 3 attorneys. Most recognized from the family law bar, 2 of whom I suspected Patricia had quietly notified, and a reporter from a local legal publication who sat in the back row with a notebook, and the practiced invisibility of someone who had learned not to make eye contact with subjects before proceedings began. Elliot was already seated when we arrived. He had a different attorney with him, not Garrison, someone younger, someone I didn't recognize, which told me Garrison had either withdrawn or been replaced in the aftermath of South Tryon. Elliot was in a dark suit, and his face had the careful composure of a man who had spent the preceding days constructing a version of events he could present in public. He did not look at Dorothy when she walked in. Dorothy looked at him. She looked at him for a long, unhurried moment. The way she had looked at me the first time we met. Complete and architectural understanding something. And then she turned to the front of the courtroom and did not look at him again. The judge was a woman named Honorable Claire Sutton, 50-something, with the efficient manner of someone who had seen every variation of this kind of proceeding and had opinions about all of them. She reviewed the submissions for 11 minutes in silence while the courtroom held its collective breath, making small notations in the margin of Patricia's filing with a mechanical pencil. Then she looked up. "I'm going to read something into the record," she said, "from the facility's own intake assessment completed by their staff physician on the day of Mrs. Reeves's admission." She found the page. "Patient presents as alert oriented to person, place, and time. Affect appropriate. Memory intact for recent and remote events. No evidence of delusion, hallucination, or cognitive impairment observed during examination. Admission based on family report of behavioral concern." She set the page down and looked at Elliot's attorney. "The facility's own physician found no clinical basis for admission," she said. "On the day of admission, does counsel for the petitioner wish to address that?" Elliot's attorney stood. He offered what he had a carefully constructed argument about family concern and precautionary measures and the difficulty of assessing cognitive decline in a single examination. He used the word precautionary 4 times. Judge Sutton let him finish. Then she said, "The commitment order is vacated. Mrs. Reeves is to be discharged immediately, not later than close of business today." She made a notation. "The court will take up the question of sanctions in the matrimonial proceeding. Counsel is directed to submit briefing within 14 days. She looked at Elliot directly for the first time. "Mr. Reeves, I want to be precise about something. The use of an involuntary commitment proceeding to remove a family member who possesses material knowledge relevant to an ongoing legal dispute is not a gray area. It is not a precaution. This court takes that seriously. Your attorneys should make sure you understand that." Elliot said nothing. Dorothy beside me sat very still. It was over in 40 minutes. In the lobby afterward, while Patricia spoke with the facility's administrator about discharge paperwork, Dorothy's neighbor Ida, a woman of 74 who had driven herself to the courthouse that morning without being asked, simply because she had read the docket notice and decided to come found us by the elevator bank, and pulled Dorothy into a long, wordless hug. Dorothy let herself be held. Her eyes were closed. When they separated, Ida held her by both shoulders and looked at her and said, "I made the gumbo. It's in your refrigerator. I used your key." Dorothy said, "You didn't have to do that." Ida said, "I know I didn't." The drive back to Dorita was quiet. Dorothy sat in the passenger seat with her hands in her lap and watched Charlotte move past the window, the familiar intersections, the neighborhoods she had known for 31 years, the particular light of a Wednesday morning in late April, falling across ordinary streets that were after 17 days, extraordinary simply by virtue of being hers again. In the driveway, she sat for a moment before getting out. "He called me," she said. Not to me specifically, to the space in front of her. 3 times while I was in there. Left voicemails. Said he'd made a mistake. Said he was sorry. I waited. I didn't call back, she said. I wanted to. He's still my son, she paused. But sorry is a beginning, not a settlement. And I needed him to understand the difference before I talked to him. She got out of the car, stood in her own driveway in her violet dress and looked at her house, the craftsman facade, the porch railing she'd painted herself 2 summers ago, the glass wind chimes at the corner that Gerald had hung and that she'd never taken down. Then she straightened her shoulders and went inside. The consequences continued to move through Elliot's life in the weeks that followed, with the unhurried thoroughness of water finding every low point in a structure. The internal review at the firm concluded. The findings were not made public. These things rarely were, but the outcome was. Elliot resigned his partnership in the third week of May, framed in the firm's internal communication as a mutual decision reached amicably, which was the professional language for a conclusion that had been made for him. His name came off the building directory. His email auto-reply redirected to a former colleague. The parking space in the building deck that had his name on a placard was within a week someone else's. The real estate projects he'd co-developed with Curtis entered a managed wind-down, neither party willing to litigate partnership dissolution on top of everything else. Both parties' attorneys engineering an exit that preserved the assets while removing the principals from further obligation to each other. Curtis posted a photograph on his company's social media page in late May. A groundbreaking for a new project, standing with a different partner, smiling the way people smile when they have made a clean decision and feel the relief of it. Elliot's mother had been put in a facility for 17 days. A judge had read the facility's own physician's assessment into a public record and called it precisely what it was. 3 attorneys had been in that courtroom. The legal publication had run a 3-paragraph summary 2 days later, careful and factual, that named no one, but described the proceeding in terms that anyone in Charlotte's professional community could decode in a single reading. Reputation, Dorothy had said, takes longer. She was right. It was taking exactly as long as it deserved. The ribbon was yellow. Dorothy's idea. She had bought it at a craft store on Central Avenue the week before a full spool of it, and spent an evening cutting lengths and tying them into precise bows with the focused attention she brought to things she had decided mattered. When I arrived at the new office on the morning of the opening, she was already there, standing on the sidewalk in a cream blouse and her good slacks, supervising the hanging of the ribbon across the front entrance with the calm authority of a woman who had opinions about how things should be done and the credibility now to express them without apology. The office was on the 3rd floor of a restored building in Noda, the same neighborhood where I had started 12 years earlier, in a studio with 2 contractor clients and a part-time assistant and more ambition than capital. The renovation had taken 4 months. I had designed it myself, which meant I had made every decision: the wide plank white oak floors, the north-facing skylights that flooded the drafting area, with the particular quality of light that made colors true, the long communal table in the center of the space, where my team could spread work flat and see it whole. The walls held nothing yet except paint. That was intentional. A new space should earn its walls before you fill them. Outside, Charlotte moved through a Thursday morning in early September with the particular energy of a city that doesn't notice individual stories, which is both its limitation and its mercy. My team arrived at 9. 7 people now. I had hired 2 additional project managers in June when the hotel commission in Asheville came through, and a junior designer named Renee who had found my firm through a professional network and sent a portfolio that made me sit with it for a long time before I called her. They came in 1s and 2s, coffee in hand, taking in the space, with the quiet appreciation of people who had helped build something and were now standing inside it. Dorothy cut the ribbon at 9:30. She did it with the scissors from her kitchen, the good ones, the orange-handled Fiskars she had kept in the knife block for 20 years, which she had brought in her purse because she said ceremony required the right tools, and borrowed scissors were bad luck. She cut it in one clean motion, the yellow halves falling away from the entrance, and the small crowd of people gathered on the sidewalk made the sound that small crowds make when something has officially begun. I hugged her for a long time. She smelled like rose water and the wool of her good blouse, and underneath both of those things, faintly, the brown sugar and pine sol of her kitchen, the smell that had defined home for me, longer than this building had existed. "Your father-in-law would have liked this space," she said into my shoulder. "I know," I said. She pulled back and looked at me the way she had the first time. Complete architectural understanding something. "He did like you," she said, "before you existed." I had thought about that often in the months since I'd read Gerald's letter. The combination set before I was born. The deed addendum drafted before Elliot had met me. A man building a check into the structure of his own estate because he knew his son and loved his son, and understood that love and accountability were not opposites. Gerald Reeves had not known my name. He had known the shape of what was needed. Someone withstanding someone whose interests were legally documented. Someone who would be there when the thing he feared became the thing that happened. He had built the door. I had walked through it. The divorce had finalized in July. Patricia had negotiated a settlement that bore no resemblance to the document Brandon had slid across my coffee table in February. The Cabarrus parcels were divided two to me, one to Elliot. The split reflecting both our named interests and the court's assessment of equitable distribution given the circumstances. The Foxcroft house sold in June, and the proceeds were divided equally. My business was valued correctly by an assessor Patricia selected and excluded from the marital estate as my separate professional enterprise. The sanctions motion resulted in a monetary award that covered my legal fees in full. With the remainder I had put into a separate account I hadn't yet decided what to do with. Elliot and I had not spoken since the morning I walked out of my own kitchen with my bag over my shoulder and his question hanging in the air behind me. He had sent one letter through Patricia 3 weeks after the finalization. Handwritten. 2 pages. I had read it twice and then put it in the accordion folder with Gerald's letter and the deed copies and the rest of the documents, because it belonged with the history of the thing, and I had not decided yet whether it warranted a response. It was honest as far as I could tell. It named what he had done without minimizing it. It said nothing that could be called an excuse. At the end, he said he hoped eventually that I was well. I was well. That was the part I was still getting used to, not the relief of the legal resolution which I had expected, but the particular quality of the well-being itself. It was not the absence of pain. It was something more active than that. The sensation of a life that had been compressed gradually over years, beginning to expand again into its actual dimensions. The way a room feels larger when you remove the furniture that was never the right scale for it. I had signed a lease on an apartment in Plaza Midwood in March. 2 bedrooms, original tile in the bathroom, a kitchen window that faced east. I had refinished the floors myself over a weekend. The walls held things I had chosen, a print I'd found at a gallery in Asheville, a photograph Dorothy had given me from Gerald's study, a small oil painting I had bought years ago and kept in storage because Elliot had called it too abstract for the living room. It wasn't too abstract. It was exactly right. Dorothy came for dinner twice a week now. She brought things, food she'd made, library books she thought I'd like, occasionally the orange-handled scissors, because she had decided they lived at my place on weeks she wasn't using them. She was in the process of writing a letter to the facility's oversight board. Drafted with the same school teacher precision, she brought to everything detailing the procedural failures that had allowed her admission to proceed without proper clinical review. She had declined for now to pursue a personal legal claim against her son. She said she was still working out where love ended and accountability began, and that it was complicated, and that complicated things deserved time. I understood. Standing in the doorway of my new office that September morning, watching my team move through the space, watching Dorothy accept a cup of coffee from Renee and begin interrogating her politely about her design process, I thought about the 7 digits she had pressed into my hand in a hospital corridor while Elliot signed the intake papers in the next room. One word I had said in the hook of this story. Just one word. That wasn't quite right. It was 7 digits. Spoken once without explanation by a woman who had been keeping them for the right moment. A combination set by a man who had understood that the most important structures are the ones built to outlast the builder. A birthday used as a key. A rug left ugly on purpose for 31 years. The safe was empty now. Patricia had recommended we photograph and remove all the documents for safekeeping, which we had done, and the safe itself had been cleaned out and left open. A steel cavity in the floor of a house that still belonged to Dorothy, had always belonged to Dorothy, and which she was in no hurry to sell or change or explain to anyone. She said she was going to put something back in it eventually. When I asked what she said, she hadn't decided. Maybe the letter Gerald had written. Maybe something of her own. Some things she said should be kept somewhere safe, not hidden, just kept. There's a difference. I thought about that on the drive home from the opening. Thought about what it meant to keep something versus hiding it. About the accordion folder in my apartment, Gerald's letter inside it, the combination written in Dorothy's schoolteacher hand on a folded piece of paper tucked beside it. About the way a building holds its history in its bones and the foundation poured before the walls went up in the load-bearing structures invisible behind the finished surfaces, in the decisions made at the beginning that determine what the whole thing can withstand. Gerald Reeves had been a contractor. He had known this. He had built accordingly. And somewhere in a house in Dorita, in the floor of a north-facing study under a rug that nobody had ever moved, because nobody had ever thought to find it beautiful, a steel door stood open for the first time in 31 years. Everything it had kept was exactly where it belonged. There is something nobody tells you about the slow kind of loss, the kind that doesn't arrive all at once, but accumulates quietly in small reclassifications and reasonable compromises, and the steady narrowing of what you believe you're allowed to expect. By the time you notice it, you've been adjusting for so long that the adjusted version feels like the original. If you recognize yourself in any part of this story, I want you to hear something the person you were before the adjustments. That person is still accurate. Still the correct version. The compression was never the truth of you. Dorothy kept cash in her apron pocket for decades. Not because she planned to leave. Because she understood that a woman who could leave, even if she never does, is a woman who stays by choice. That distinction matters. It changes the entire nature of the staying. And Gerald, a man I never met, who died before I existed in his son's life, built a door for me anyway. Not because he knew me. Because he understood that the people we love sometimes need to be answered to by someone who loves them differently than we do. He built accountability into the structure of his estate, the way a good contractor builds load-bearing walls, not because he expected the building to fail, but because he understood that good structures account for what they cannot predict. You are allowed to know where the safe is. You are allowed to have your name on the deed. You are allowed to walk through a door that was built before you knew it was yours. If this story stayed with you, drop a comment and tell me why. Tell me what you're keeping safe. Tell me what door you've been standing in front of without trying the handle. And if you know someone who needs to hear this today, share it with them. I'll see you in the next one.